Good morning. Well, leave it to March to make you feel like a grizzly bear, where you go to bed in summer and wake up back in the winter. Our text today comes from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15. And I would be lying if I said that these 7 verses had no controversy found in them, especially today in our society and even in our churches. Verse 9 begins with a word that says likewise, in like manner. So what Paul is about to say has some similar characteristics to what he had just previously said. Paul, unlike some people today, recognized that God created male and female, and as men and women that God has created, God has given us some different roles that we are to fulfill. In verses 1 through 8, just above the passage that we're looking at today, men are encouraged and even commanded to pray in the home, in public, especially in the church. And it says that men are to lead basically as examples of intercessory prayer, praying for the world, praying for leaders, and so forth. I didn't make this distinction specifically last week about being called to prayer as men specifically, because all of us can pray. It doesn't have to just be men, but it is a role that men are called to lead in. And in verse 8, Paul then says that he wants men everywhere to be praying, lifting up holy hands, either physically or from a holy life, and to do that without anger, without resentment, without disagreeing with God. And one reason I did not make the distinction last week is because since Christ's resurrection, certainly everyone can pray and lift others up. We all have access to the Father, even at times when we don't know what to pray, the Spirit intercedes for us. Men and women can certainly all pray. Listen to Joel chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. And this passage is actually repeated in Acts chapter 2. And it says that I will pour out my spirit. God is speaking. I will pour out my spirit on all mankind, on all humanity. On your sons and daughters, they will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams, and your young men will see visions. Even on the male and female servants, I will pour out my spirit in those days. Paul himself would not discourage women from praying. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 5, he says that if a woman is praying or prophesying with her head uncovered, she brings disgrace on her head, or she brings shame upon herself. And we're not going to get into what this covering means today. In Corinthians, it would take another whole study to get into the culture and what Paul meant there. But the point of this passage for today, he was instructing women how to pray and prophesy. He didn't tell them not to do that. He was giving them instructions how to do that godly in their culture. So Paul did not stop them in Corinthians from praying or prophesying, but again, he has called men to lead in public intercessory prayer for people, for kings, for presidents, for leaders, for everyone in authority. As we contemplate these things moving forward in 2 Timothy, keep in mind these instructions are given from Paul to Timothy on how men and women are to function within the church and how the church structure should even be set up. So, verse 8, men, pray. Verse 9, likewise. And so here comes some specific instructions for women. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15. I'll read from the New American Standard Bible, 1995, printed by the Lothman Foundation. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was created first, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith, love, and sanctity with self-restraint. As I said, plenty of modern day controversial statements. Certainly Paul doesn't expect these kind of behaviors today, does he? I mean, why does he have to hate on us so much? To squish my dreams and my desires and the ways that I feel God calling me? Well, let's look at this a little more in depth. Again, men are to be praying. Verse 9, likewise, women are to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly, discreetly, without braided hair and costly garments. The general teaching here is, don't try to call so much attention to yourself. Don't try to call so much attention to yourself. In first century, this idea about this braided hair, in the first century, a lot of braiding was actually called plaiting. And in this plaiting, this I found in a couple of different commentaries, but John MacArthur kind of elaborates on it a little bit. It would include things like gold and pearls, perhaps other jewelry that's actually braided into the hair. Honestly, I've seen some of this today, even in different cultures. People with all kinds of personal expression today do things like this. But it's why? Because it draws attention to themselves. Paul is not saying, he is not saying that you shouldn't dress nice. You know, he's not saying don't wear nice clothing, but work at not drawing attention to yourselves. Clothing that is appropriate, modest, discreet clothing. A young woman that worked at the cafe that I managed in Fort Wayne, she attended Grace College at Winona Lake, Indiana. And she went to a chapel service one day, and the speaker was talking about modesty and clothing and so forth. After the chapel, they had a question and answer time. And some of the things he said in that chapel service, he said, look, especially you young women, don't dress with tight clothing. Don't wear tight-fitting blouses or a lot of midriff t-shirts or low-cut tops. And so later in this question and answer time, the girl that worked at the cafe, she said a woman she knew, a college student she knew, raised her hand and she asked a question. And she said, I don't get it. She said, if I don't wear those kinds of clothing, how am I supposed to attract a guy? Now, keep in mind, this is a Christian college. Boy, what do you say right off? Well, in case anybody in here doesn't know it by now, men are generally more visually stimulated. You see something and you're like, oh, what's that? In fact, today, as I saw Dwayne looking out the window, something caught his eye, something visually, got to see what that is. So again, the point is to dress modestly. How do you attract a guy? Well, let's look at verse 10. Now, I know in here, really no one is trying to attract anybody, perhaps anymore. But it's a policy that we can teach nephews, nieces, others that we come in contact with. Verse 10. Verse 10, Paul says this. He says, attract them with your good works that line up with godliness. Peter says it this way in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Your adornment must not be merely external, the braiding of the hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. Godly good works, gentle spirit, quiet spirit, these imperishable qualities, precious in God's sight. And honestly, again, these are excellent things for all of us to strive for. Does not have to be limited to women. Verse 11 goes on, though, and says this. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. Lots of words that nobody likes. To be honest, this statement probably caused as much controversy in the first century as it does today. In the first century, Jewish girls received very little teaching, very little education. Mostly they were taught home economics type things, cooking, how to make millet bread, sewing, things like this. And they would have had a basic teaching of Old Testament laws, but most of that teaching comes from their family at home. It is not done, in the first century, it was not done widely in public. In fact, according to an article that I read in Wikipedia, which is always questionable about how accurate that is, but there was an article in Wikipedia that said that really didn't change much until the 19th and 20th century. Jewish girls were not educated in public much until the 19th and 20th century. In addition to the Jewish culture, the surrounding culture wasn't much better. Now, Plato, remember we spoke about him a few times lately. Plato in the Greek culture had tried to kind of elevate women to be about equal with men. But Plato's student Aristotle believed that women's activities should be severely limited. And it was actually Aristotle's views that were generally accepted and adopted in the culture. So here, Paul says in verse 11, he says, women must quietly receive instruction. That was countercultural. Paul is actually elevating women in the church to receive the same kind of instruction that the men did, to learn these biblical truths and the things that God has for us. He was actually putting the position of women in the church higher than the women in the culture. And that's, I think, one reason why he adds with entire submissiveness. Because as the women in society struggled to gain more approval and position, Paul says, no, women should be taught everything that we're taught, but with submissiveness. And his point would be not to usurp the authority that God has given, the biblical authority that God has given for churches. One more reason I believe that Paul wants women in the church to have biblical instructions and teachings. It's going to be found here in our next 3 verses, but it actually goes back all the way to the Garden of Eden. Verse 12. Verse 12 is one of the hottest debated verses in modern Christendom. Even in MCUSA, in the Southern Baptist Convention, it is even discussed quite debatedly in different sectors of LMC. Verse 12. Paul says this. Okay, yes, women, please be taught, teach. However, verse 12, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Again, this is specifically more directed at being pastors or bishops in the church. Why? Why, Paul? Why are you so harsh? Well, Paul gives some reasons. Number 1, in verse 13, he says, because Adam was created first, and Eve was created second from Adam. And secondly, in verse 14, he elaborates and he says, Adam was not deceived, but Eve was deceived and fell into transgression. Look back at verse 11. I think one of the reasons Paul says that women should be instructed and learn and have these biblical teachings is that so they will not be easily deceived. And again, this is true for all of us. It'll be true for all of us. The more we know the truth, the less easily Satan or the world can deceive us. Now, something that Paul doesn't cover in this passage here in 1 Timothy is Adam's role in bringing the sin nature into the world. In Genesis chapter 2, God had created and said that everything was very good. He planted the Garden of Eden, and he placed Adam in the garden to take care of it. And God told him, he said, eat from any tree except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The day that you eat of it, you will die. He plants the garden, he puts Adam there, he gives him one command. But then immediately in the next verse, God says this. It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a suitable helper. So when God places Adam in the garden and gives him this command, to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Eve's not there yet. She's not created yet. This is a command that has been given from God to Adam. God's design from the beginning is that Adam should lead spiritually and teach Eve the things of God. But what happened? Well, after Eve was created, they're in the garden. In Genesis chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, the serpent told Eve, look, if you eat from this tree, you're not going to die. God knows that your eyes are going to be open, you're going to be like him, and you will know the difference between good and evil. Oh, Eve's like, wow. And in verse 6, Genesis 3:6, Eve says, or it says this about Eve. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from the fruit and ate. In other words, she was deceived. This is the deception. And, the verse continues, she gave also to her husband with her. She didn't go track him down and say, hey, look what I learned. He's standing there. I don't know what he was thinking about this talking serpent or exactly how that all took place, but he's right there with her. And he did not step in. He did not lead. He did not say, remember, God said, don't do that. And she gave the fruit to him as well. Yesterday, we were at a Friends of Israel prophecy conference over in Sugar Creek. And one of the speakers, Steve Herzig, did I say that name right? Steve Herzig. He made this observation about Adam and Christ. When confronted with temptation, Adam stopped standing on the Word of God. God said, don't eat that fruit. He stopped leading Eve spiritually, and Adam gave in to the flesh, and he ate. Christ, when he was in the wilderness and was being tempted, after 40 days, he was hungry. The passage says he was hungry. He was thirsty. He was physically weak. But he overcame those temptations because he continued to stand firm on God's word. According to Romans chapter 5, verses 12 to 14, it was through Adam's offense that sin and death entered the world and spread to all of humanity. It was Adam's sin that did this, not Eve's. Coming back with that, back to 1 Timothy, teach. Women must be instructed in biblical truths, but they should not be pastors and bishops with authority. I truly believe, I really honestly believe, one reason so many women have had the opportunity to step into positions like pastoral roles or bishop roles, especially over the past 20 or 40 years, I think is because a lot of men in the church have what I call an Adam syndrome. Adam syndrome. I think a lot of Christian men have become complacent and simply don't step into the leadership roles that they could. Anyhow, that's an off-the-cuff thought. Well, actually, maybe this is even more off the cuff. We do have women pastors today, and so I will say this. You know, if God can speak through a donkey, I think anyone willing, God can certainly use, but it wasn't the way it was set up. Well, if that's not quite enough controversy, there's one more verse. I'll reread it first. Verse 15. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-control or self-restraint. This verse, if I took all of the things that were written about this verse in the different commentaries that I looked at, and I certainly didn't read many compared to what's written, it could have its own chapter, probably its own book written about this verse, because it is extremely difficult to just exegete and figure out exactly what Paul is saying. Some believe that this verse is saying that even though Eve was deceived, women will be saved through childbirth because Christ was born through childbirth. Now, that's a beautiful sentiment. It sounds wonderful, but it really doesn't fit the context of 1 Timothy chapter 2. And so a lot of commentary writers, theologians reject that, and I would tend to agree with that. Again, it's a beautiful concept. In addition, some believe that this speaks about Christian women who marry and have children and are able to teach them and raise them up in the truth. Therefore, yes, Eve was deceived, but women in general do not have to be trapped in that path. They can raise children up. Again, another good concept. But there are thousands of Christian women that have never married and have died. I know Christian women today that have never married, and unless they become something like Sarah, they never will. I know thousands of women, Christian women, that never had children. And so it's hard to say that women will be preserved through childbirth if they have a child, when so many Christian women have not done that. And this is another attempt to explain this, but a lot of people reject it. And I really struggle with that explanation as well. One part of the explanations, I do agree with commentaries, is that this word preserved, that women will be preserved, does not mean salvation. A woman cannot be saved by having children. That goes against everything else in Scripture that says salvation is by faith alone. So what does all this mean? What can we conclude? Maybe we can say something like this. Women in general are not condemned simply because Eve was deceived. There is another path. And this application is perhaps a little hidden in this context. Again, what Paul meant here is it's exceedingly difficult for anyone really to explain it fully. So I'm going to give just a couple ideas from this passage in general, verses 9 through 15. And again, men, many of these things can apply to us. But one of the things I think can be drawn out is, again, don't try to draw so much attraction to yourself or your accomplishments or physicalness, but work at trying to draw attention to God and His love and His mercy and what He has done for us. Let's perform the good works that God has given us to do, to walk in, the good works that are according to godliness. and to receive instruction, to learn God's truth. And with that, we're more able to overcome temptations. All of us can probably learn to be more submissive to the authority that's over us, be that beyond the church into our societies, the government, and then to be willing to spiritually lead in whatever position God has placed you in. And perhaps one of the last things with this verse 15 is whether you're married, single, anything in between, with what we learn, with how we're instructed, we can teach those around us. We can teach our nieces, our nephews. We can teach our neighbors, our friends' children. We can teach friends in general. Teach Sunday school classes. Women are so much more nurturing and compassionate, typically, than most men, and it's something that we can learn from you as well. And perhaps above all, we can learn to guard against being deceived. Learn to stand firm in the Word as Christ did, rather than giving in to the flesh like Adam did.